Hi everyone. So we are back with Vanya, a true story from Myrna Grant, and we are at chapter 7. He goes from the bear to fall in with wolves. His cell was very small and cold and without light. When his eyes became accustomed to the dark, he could make out a bunk along one wall and only enough space in the cell for him to fully extend his arm and touch the opposite side. The cell door had a small window near the top, through which the guards shone flashlights during the night. His bones ached with inactivity. Painfully he pulled off his boots and pressed his stockinged feet against the damp cement wall. After the constant swaying of the train, the clatter of the wheels and the hum of the prisoners' voices, the cell was grave-like in its deathly stillness and silence. Even lay in the cold, his exhaustion unrelieved by sleep. The old man's words, warrior and worker, turned in his mind like the wheels of the train. His mind moved to the experience of the heavenly planet with the angel. You still have much work to do, the angel had said, warrior and worker. Cold fear, like a thin sheet of ice, seemed to hang over his bunk, close above him, in the dark. What work was ahead? What warring? The fear, as if suspended by ropes, seemed to slip a notch closer to his face. My soul waits in silence for God only. From him is my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold. I shall not be shaken. The interrogation room of the prison was in a frame building a few paces from Evan's cell block. It was a spacious room with sagging wood floors and a painting radiator that ran the length of the room and reminded Ivan suddenly of his kindergarten on the collective farm in Moldavia. Some ferns at the end of the room decorated a few wooden steps leading to a very small platform on which was placed a picture of Lenin. Ivan guessed that the room was also used for cultural events. An official of the prison sat behind a conference table covered in purple cloth at the side of the room. 4 other men in plain clothes sat at another table nearby, but it was the prison officer who spoke. In his hands were Ivan's documents. It was commendable that Moiseyev had taken the oath of loyalty to the Red Army. This was something Baptists often refused. Moiseyev had started off well, but had quickly proved to be an agitator, refusing correction, determined to cling to his old beliefs and to reject Soviet socialist teaching, seeking to persuade others to do the same. His loyalty to the Red Army was under question, and his attitude towards authority ran afoul of all military life. In spite of dedicated efforts on the part of his superiors toward his re-education, Moiseyev had spurned all such assistance and had created incident after incident in his desire to disrupt. It was an example of the clemency of the Soviet state that he was given so many opportunities to change his views. There was no question that already there was much evidence against him. Did he know that he could be brought to trial and sentenced to prison for 7 years? Article 142 of the Criminal Code could be brought to bear since he had openly admitted that he was a member of an unregistered Baptist group. There were Articles 181 and 182 concerning bearing false witness. It had been established that much of his conversation was composed of utter impossible lies, and that he had several times perjured himself. Article 190, paragraph 1 was relevant. In his letter writing, he had deliberately distributed literature containing false statements slandering the Soviet state and the Red Army. His letters to his family had been copied and were positive proof. In the matter of Article 58, paragraph 10, concerning anti-Soviet agitation, his situation was very serious indeed. Already he was inside the walls of a prison. Still, he was given yet another opportunity to avail himself of re-education here in Sverdlovsk. If he refused to cooperate, persuasive measures would be administered. Ivan spoke slowly, concentrating on his words as he formed them. It was often difficult not to be able to speak in his native Moldavian. Russian constructions and endings would vanish from his memory when he was tired or most needed them. I have done nothing against the Soviet state. I have desired to quietly do my work in the army and at the same time worship and praise God. As for disturbances, it is the military who makes them, not I. As for staying here for 7 years, I will, if it pleases God. If not, then tomorrow I shall be sent back to my base. Of this, I am certain. The new cell to which Ivan was sent was a tiny cubicle like a cage, 4 feet square. Taking up most of the floor space was a small bench similar to the ones small children use in schools. Like the first cell, it was very cold and without light. For 2 days, Ivan painfully huddled on the stool, time wrapped around him like a dark cloth, torn only by the opening of the cell door for bread and weak coffee to be passed in and the waste bucket to be passed out. Once or twice, when awakening in his suffocating panic after a sleep, the sense of Christ's presence was with him, and it was so tangible and quieting that Ivan wept with joy. The freezing agony in his cramped limbs dulled. Hot pain shot through his muscles when he was finally pulled out of the cell and stood upright in the blazing light of the corridor. A guard jabbed him with the barrel of a machine gun, prodding him outside into the intense cold to the interrogation building. The same prison authority stood beside the table, his hand fingering a dog whip he had tucked into his belt. "So, you are out of your hole, and breathing good socialist air. It seems you did not spend your time begging for release in the past 2 days. You have done some thinking. Then, perhaps you are willing now to take off the blindfold you have put over your own eyes and to enter the real Soviet world. Ivan felt the rims of his eyes burning in the pale sunlight. He tried to control an irrational feeling that if he spoke, his voice would be too faint to be heard. The official's face blazed before him. His words were slow in coming. There is a scripture that says the lives of believers are hid with Christ in God. That is the real world, and I am in it. At Ivan's reply, the officer stayed speechless for a long minute. Grasping his whip, he struck the conference table dramatically. He struck it again and again as if lashing a beast, his eyes never for a moment leaving Ivan's face. As a child on the collective farm, Ivan had seen a drunken worker beat an ox. The animal, yoked and tied in a pen, had no escape. Blood had run down its legs and dripped in the mud from the flesh laid bare by the worker's whip. Some shift in Ivan's mind suddenly filled him with horror. "This is the real world," the officer was shouting, advancing to Ivan. The whip erect and in his shaking hand. You imagine that God can hide you from what is ahead of you? We will see how you feel when your God does not save you from the reality I will choose for you. For a moment, Ivan braced himself for the cut of the whip he expected, but the officer wheeled abruptly, his steps firing like bullets across the long room. In an instant, 2 guards appeared, shoving Ivan ahead of them toward the prison. Ivan hesitated in fear at the small door opened for him by the guard. "Inside, inside!" The guard heaved his rifle into Ivan's back, sending him skidding into the small cell. The door was instantly slammed and bolted. Water splashed over his boots and streamed down the walls. A dim light hung in a cage from the low ceiling, but partially obscured by a crisscross of ice-covering pipes. Water dripped rapidly from every pipe, trickled from the seams, spurted from the connections, and drained sluggishly into a drain coated with ice in a corner of the cell. Almost immediately, Ivan discovered it was not possible to stand anywhere out of the dripping, icy water. It showered his coat and ran down the back of his neck as he hunched into his clothing. An impulse to pound on the milky ice of the door seized him. Within minutes he began to shake violently. "Be gracious to me, O God, be gracious to me, for my soul takes refuge in thee, and in the shadow of thy wings I will take refuge, until destruction passes by. I will cry to God Most High, to God who accomplishes all these things for me. He will send me from heaven and save me." Through the ragged curtain of water, he was startled by the unmoving eyes of a guard, watching him from the door peephole. Thou hast taken account of my wanderings, put my tears in thy bottle, and are they not in thy book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. By pressing himself into a corner of the cell, his back to the downfall, Ivan found he could avoid most of the water. Over and over he repeated the words of the psalm that seemed to come from beside him, from all around the cell. At the same time, his mind, independent in some way from the scriptures, he was half shouting, was in a torment to escape. As time passed, the frenzied shaking of his body slowed into a terrible ache that began to spread from every joint in his body and to his back and head. His feet, pressed into his soaking boots, were in an agony of pain that forced him onto the floor of the cell. Half kneeling in the ice and water, he began to imagine he was in an Orthodox cathedral with banks of candles flickering warmly and richly framed icons. Many people were worshipping all around, and a glory of music and praise filled the cathedral. The service was long, very long. This time the interrogation room was within the prison block itself, a large stone room with smoky fire burning near a desk. Ivan lay on a cot at the far end of the room, away from the fireplace, an electric heater glowing on the floor beside him. How he had been brought to the cot, or how long ago, he had no idea. He was aware of the smell of singed cloth as he began to rouse. Stiffly he raised himself. A high barred window, dry walls, a few prison officials around the fireplace came into view and then slid away as he fell back. A guard standing behind him yanked him violently to a sitting position, cursing the dead weight of Ivan's body. It seemed unimportant that what the officer was saying, but Ivan tried to listen. He felt terribly ill. "You will receive your ration of bread and coffee. It is our determination to return you to the base at Kerch, conformable to the standards of a Soviet youth. Those are our orders. You have proven to be obstinate. Moseyev, but I think we have demonstrated to you that you are not going to have your way. As soon as you indicate your willingness to reform, we will consider that sufficient progress to discharge you from here and see that you are able to resume your training period as the military intends and as is your obligation to the Soviet Union." A mug of weak coffee was placed on the table beside Ivan's cot, a thin tin plate of bread serving as an unsteady lid. Prayerfully, Ivan lifted the cup to his lips, breathing in the stream of the coffee. Never had the symbolic wine of the Lord's Supper seemed as holy as this cup. Christ's words flooded his mind. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is to be shed on behalf of many." With a surge of love, Ivan drained the mug. Reverently, he broke off a chunk of bread. "Take, eat. This is my body." "We have some papers here, Moseyev, which you might wish to sign," the officer continued. They indicate your willingness to cooperate fully with Colonel Molson, commander of your base in Kerch, and to give you your complete obedience to any order that comes from any officer or any department for the duration of your service in the Red Army. When you finish eating, your signature is all I need to begin the procedure for your release. In the following days, Ivan was even further plunged into the prison's nightmare world. You are being sent to the room of the frozen, an old guard had whispered to him. Sorry. Give in. You won't live. How many hours could he live? Even wondered, in a refrigeration cell. Light snow covered the cells on the walls and ceiling as the thick door thudded shut. Time passed with his fear mounting. Pain began, and still the door remained sealed. The whiteness of the cell seemed luminous. Scriptures he knew, memories of home, and the knowledge of the light-filled place to which he was going finally quieted him. Gradually the fear and pain subsided, and he began to doze. Profoundly thankful, he lay down on the floor of the cell. In the beginning, he had thought the pressing and squeezing was a dream. He was a cosmonaut drifting into freezing space. But the pressure suit was real, and the shouts in his ears, "Will you give in? Will you change your beliefs?" jarred him into consciousness. He was strangling. He couldn't breathe. In space there were angels appearing and disappearing in their brilliance. For he will give his angels charge concerning you, to guard you in all your ways. If I explode, I shall explode into heaven. The pressure was increased. Even tried to help the suit, tried himself to break through the anguish and suffocation to that lush place he had been with the angel. "Will you change your beliefs? We will stop the pressure. Change, or you will be here for 7 years. He was not sure they could hear his voice. He gasped the words with tremendous effort. "If it is God's will, I will be here. If not, gone tomorrow." The prison officer crumbled his empty Bollamore package into the wastebasket by his desk and fumbled through his drawer for more cigarettes. He lit one and inhaled with concentration. He had no further instructions on how to proceed. As a soldier, Moiseyev ought to be charged and sentenced by a military tribunal. It was possible to keep him indefinitely in Sverdlovsk, of course, but he had no orders to that effect. Technically, the prison committee had carried out its responsibility. For 12 days, Moiseyev had been exposed to the most thorough of interrogations and re-education techniques. Other than shipping him to Kerch in a box, there was no more to be done. Moiseyev would have a long, uncomfortable train journey back to Kerch in which to recover and think over his future. Let the commissars in Kerch or Odessa worry about what to do with him. They could not explain that Sverdlovsk's techniques had not been vigorously applied. Sverdlovsk would wash its hands off Moiseyev. The officer's eye was caught by a small bird alighting on the smudged window of his windowsill. On the smudged snow of his windowsill. It picked at the frozen crumbs he placed there day by day. There were fewer birds every year since all the new industry came in. He watched the bird anxiously. The sky was dirty. The snow was dirty. Everything was dirty these days. Next time, chapter 8. See you again.